The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete jungle of downtown Phoenix, Arizona, as Detective Marcus Rivera pulled his patrol car into the precinct parking lot. Steam rose from his coffee cup in the desert heat, already promising another scorching day in the Valley of the Sun. Marcus had been working the overnight shift for 6 months now, ever since his partner retired and left him to break in rookies who couldn't handle the city's growing crime rate. But today felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the 100-degree temperature. 3 blocks away, Dr. Emily Watson adjusted her CDC identification badge as she approached the sleek glass building that housed the Phoenix Regional Disease Control Center. Her red-eye flight from Atlanta had landed just 2 hours ago, and the urgent nature of her assignment still puzzled her. The initial reports described a series of violent attacks in the city's outskirts, but the symptoms didn't match any known pathogen in their database. Victims displayed extreme aggression, complete loss of higher brain function, and a disturbing resistance to pain that allowed them to continue attacking even after sustaining serious injuries. Emily's expertise in emerging viral threats had earned her a reputation as the CDC's go-to specialist for unusual outbreaks, but something about this case sent chills down her spine. Meanwhile, in the industrial district on the city's eastern edge, Jake Thompson wiped sweat from his forehead as he supervised the construction crew installing steel beams for a new apartment complex. The former Marine had traded his combat boots for work boots 3 years ago, but his military discipline still showed in the precise way he organized his team and managed the job site. Jake noticed that 2 of his regular crew members, Rodriguez and Mitchell, hadn't shown up for work today. Both were reliable guys with families to support, so their absence worried him more than he cared to admit. The crew foreman mentioned that Rodriguez had called in sick with what sounded like a severe throat infection, his voice barely recognizable through the phone. Across town at Roosevelt High School, Madison Clark arranged colorful posters around her classroom, preparing for another day of teaching American history to teenagers more interested in their smartphones than the Revolutionary War. The 28-year-old teacher had chosen education because she believed in shaping young minds, but lately the job felt more like crowd control than actual teaching. Madison's optimistic nature helped her connect with even the most challenging students, earning her the nickname Miss Sunshine from her colleagues. As she wrote the day's lesson plan on the whiteboard, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the world outside her classroom windows. The first sign of trouble came at 10:47 a.m. when Marcus received a dispatch call about a disturbance at Sunset Mall. The initial report described a man attacking shoppers in the food court, but the details seemed almost too bizarre to believe. Witnesses claimed the attacker was biting people, tearing at their flesh with his teeth while making inhuman growling sounds. Marcus had seen plenty of drug-related violence in his 12 years on the force, but this description reminded him more of a rabid animal than a human being. He grabbed his radio and requested backup, though he suspected the responding officers would find nothing more than an overdosed junkie who needed medical attention. At the same time, Emily was reviewing preliminary blood samples from 3 patients admitted to Phoenix General Hospital with similar symptoms. Under the microscope, she observed cellular structures that defied conventional medical understanding. The virus appeared to be attacking the brain's prefrontal cortex while simultaneously flooding the system with adrenaline and other stress hormones. More disturbing was the rate of cellular reproduction she witnessed in the samples. The pathogen was replicating at an unprecedented speed, suggesting an incubation period measured in hours rather than days. Emily reached for her secure phone to contact CDC headquarters in Atlanta, but the line was busy. Jake's unease grew when the construction site security guard, an elderly man named Peterson, stumbled into the work area covered in blood and speaking incoherently about monsters in the parking lot. The guard's eyes were completely bloodshot, and he kept clawing at his own face as if trying to remove something invisible. Jake immediately called 911, but the operator seemed overwhelmed with similar calls flooding the emergency system. As he waited for paramedics to arrive, Jake noticed that Peterson's wounds weren't bleeding normally. The blood looked darker, almost black, and had a strange consistency. Madison's morning took a disturbing turn when she received an automated message from the school district warning of increased security measures due to unusual incidents reported throughout the city. The message was deliberately vague, but it instructed teachers to keep students indoors and avoid dismissing anyone early without proper authorization. Through her classroom window, Madison could see unusual activity in the streets below, people running in various directions, emergency vehicles racing past with sirens blaring, and what appeared to be smoke rising from several locations on the horizon. The afternoon news would later report these as the first confirmed signs of what would become known as the Phoenix outbreak, though by then, it would be far too late to stop the chaos about to engulf their world. The first scream pierced the morning air at exactly 11:23 a.m., echoing through the corridors of Sunset Mall like a warning bell for the apocalypse. Detective Marcus Rivera arrived at the scene to find chaos beyond his worst nightmares. What had started as a routine disturbance call had exploded into something that defied every protocol in his training manual. The food court was splattered with blood, overturned tables scattered like broken bones across the polished floor. But it wasn't the destruction that froze Marcus in place. It was the sight of ordinary people tearing into each other with savage, animalistic fury. A woman in a business suit was crouched over a fallen teenager, her face buried in his neck as she fed with grotesque satisfaction. Her eyes, when she finally looked up at Marcus, were completely white, devoid of any human recognition or emotion. The teenager beneath her twitched and convulsed, dark veins spreading across his pale skin like poison ivy. Marcus drew his weapon, but hesitated when he realized the woman showed no response to his shouted commands. She simply returned to her gruesome meal, ignoring the gun pointed at her head. The sound of more screams from deeper in the mall told Marcus this wasn't an isolated incident. The infection was spreading faster than wildfire through dry grass. Across the city, Dr. Emily Watson watched in horror as her colleagues at the Phoenix Regional Disease Control Center transformed before her eyes. The first sign of trouble came when Dr. Martinez, the facility's lead researcher, stumbled into the main laboratory with blood streaming down his face. Emily initially thought he'd been injured in an accident, but as she approached to help, she noticed the unnatural way he moved, jerky, predatory, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Martinez's breathing was labored and wet, producing a disturbing gurgling sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. When he turned toward Emily, his eyes held the same terrifying blankness she'd observed in the blood samples under her microscope. The virus wasn't just attacking the brain's higher functions, it was completely rewriting human behavior, turning people into something fundamentally different. Emily backed away slowly, her scientific mind racing to process what she was witnessing. Martinez lunged forward with inhuman speed, his fingers curled into claws as he reached for her throat. Emily dodged behind a laboratory table, her heart pounding as she realized the samples she'd been studying were no longer contained to petri dishes. The facility's emergency lockdown protocols activated automatically, sealing the exits as red warning lights bathed the corridors in an ominous glow. Through the reinforced windows, Emily could see more infected staff members wandering the hallways, their movements becoming increasingly coordinated as if they were responding to some collective instinct. Meanwhile, Jake Thompson's construction site had become a war zone. The blood-covered security guard, Peterson, wasn't acting alone anymore. 3 other workers had joined him, moving with the same predatory coordination that Emily was observing across town. Jake's military training kicked in as he assessed the tactical situation. These weren't random attacks. The infected were working together, surrounding his remaining crew members with calculated precision. Jake grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox and shouted for his men to grab whatever weapons they could find. The infected workers showed no fear of the construction equipment or tools being wielded against them. They absorbed impacts that should have incapacitated them, continuing their relentless advance despite broken bones and severe lacerations. Jake realized with growing dread that traditional crowd control methods were useless against enemies who felt no pain and showed no self-preservation instincts. When Rodriguez appeared at the construction site's entrance, Jake felt a moment of relief until he saw his friend's condition. Rodriguez's throat infection had progressed into something far more sinister. His neck was swollen and discolored, with dark veins visible beneath the skin. The man who had worked beside Jake for 2 years was gone, replaced by something that viewed his former colleagues as nothing more than prey. At Roosevelt High School, Madison Clark's ordinary Tuesday morning transformed into a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The first indication of trouble came when Principal Johnson's voice crackled over the intercom system, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. He announced an immediate lockdown, instructing all teachers to secure their classrooms and await further instructions. Madison quickly moved to lock her door and pull down the window shades, her training for active shooter situations taking over. But the sounds filtering through the building weren't gunshots. They were screams, growls, and the terrifying sound of bodies hitting walls and floors. Madison's 17 students huddled together in the corner of the room, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Through the small window in her classroom door, Madison caught glimpses of figures moving through the hallways with that same jerky, unnatural gait that was becoming the signature of the infected. When she saw Mrs. Patterson, the beloved librarian, stumbling past with her cardigan soaked in blood and her kind eyes now cold and empty, Madison realized they were facing something far worse than any human threat. The infected seemed drawn to sound and movement, clustering around classroom doors where frightened voices could be heard. Madison whispered urgent instructions to her students, knowing that their survival depended on remaining completely silent while the monsters prowled the corridors outside. 2 days had passed since the world ended, though time seemed meaningless in the new reality that had consumed Phoenix. Detective Marcus Rivera crouched behind an overturned police cruiser, his uniform torn and blood-stained, as he surveyed the abandoned warehouse district where he'd managed to establish a temporary safe zone. The building he'd chosen was a fortress of concrete and steel, with only 2 entrances that could be easily defended and reinforced. Marcus had spent the first night barricading the loading dock doors with every piece of furniture and debris he could find, while 17 other survivors helped him create what felt like the last bastion of humanity in a city overrun by monsters. The group was a random collection of people who'd found each other in the chaos. A nurse named Rebecca who'd escaped from Phoenix General Hospital, an elderly mechanic called Walt who knew every back alley in the city, and a family of 4 who'd fled their suburban home when their neighbors began attacking each other in the streets. Marcus had taken charge naturally, his police training providing the leadership structure the frightened survivors desperately needed, but he knew their current situation was unsustainable without more resources and expertise. Meanwhile, Dr. Emily Watson had spent 48 hours navigating the underground maintenance tunnels beneath the CDC facility, clutching a waterproof bag containing the only remaining samples of the virus and her hastily compiled research notes. The facility's emergency lockdown had saved her life, but it had also trapped her with the infected remains of her colleagues for nearly 18 hours before she managed to escape through the building's sub-basement. Emily's scientific mind had been working overtime, analyzing everything she'd observed about the infection's progression and behavior patterns. The virus appeared to be engineered rather than naturally occurring, with modifications that suggested someone had deliberately enhanced its transmission rate and neurological effects. More disturbing was her discovery that the infected retained certain problem-solving abilities and could coordinate their attacks in ways that suggested some form of collective intelligence. Emily had witnessed groups of infected working together to break through barriers, using tools and even setting simple traps for uninfected humans. As she emerged from a storm drain 3 blocks from Marcus's warehouse, Emily could see smoke rising from multiple locations across the city, indicating that the infection had spread far beyond its original containment zone. Jake Thompson had become a one-man rescue operation, using his military training and construction knowledge to navigate the city's dangerous new landscape. After fighting his way out of the construction site, Jake had commandeered a heavy-duty pickup truck and begun searching for other survivors, driven by a moral code that wouldn't let him abandon people to the infected hordes. His latest rescue had been the most challenging yet, a group of 8 families trapped in the Riverside apartments, surrounded by dozens of infected who had learned to climb fire escapes and break down doors with systematic efficiency. Jake's approach was methodical and brutal when necessary, but he discovered that the infected had weaknesses that could be exploited. They were attracted to loud sounds and bright lights, which could be used to create distractions, and they seemed to have difficulty with complex vertical movements like climbing ladders. More importantly, Jake had observed that the infected avoided certain areas of the city, particularly locations with strong chemical smells or electrical interference. His truck was now loaded with emergency supplies, medical equipment, and enough weapons to arm a small militia, all acquired through carefully planned raids on abandoned stores and emergency service buildings. Madison Clark had proven that teachers possess survival skills that extend far beyond the classroom, successfully evacuating her 17 students from Roosevelt High School using a combination of strategic planning and sheer determination. The escape had required her to think like both an educator and a military tactician, timing their movements to avoid infected patrol patterns while keeping terrified teenagers calm and focused. Madison had converted a school bus into a mobile fortress, reinforcing the windows with metal shop equipment and creating secure sleeping areas in the back rows. Her students had become her unofficial army, each assigned specific responsibilities for watch duty, supply management, and vehicle maintenance. The group had been living in the bus for 2 days, moving constantly to avoid detection while searching for a more permanent safe haven. Madison's natural optimism had been tested by the horrors she'd witnessed, but her determination to protect her students had given her strength she never knew she possessed. Through her radio scanning, she picked up fragments of transmissions from other survivor groups, including what sounded like a police officer coordinating rescue operations from a warehouse in the industrial district. The convergence began at sunset on the second day, when Jake's rescue truck encountered Madison's fortified school bus at an intersection 6 blocks from Marcus's warehouse. The initial meeting was tense, with both groups suspicious of potential threats, but Madison students recognized Jake as a local hero who'd been helping people throughout the crisis. Emily arrived at the same intersection 30 minutes later, drawn by the sound of engines and voices, her CDC credentials immediately establishing her importance to the group's survival. Marcus had heard the commotion and dispatched a scouting party, leading to the first face-to-face meeting between the 4 individuals who would become the cornerstone of humanity's resistance against the infected plague that had consumed their world. 7 days after the initial outbreak, the underground bunker system beneath Phoenix had become both sanctuary and prison for the growing community of survivors that had rallied around Marcus, Emily, Jake, and Madison. The discovery of the tunnel network had been accidental. Walt, the elderly mechanic, remembered stories his grandfather told about Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels that connected various buildings downtown. What they found was far more extensive: a maze of maintenance corridors, storm drains, and forgotten Cold War-era fallout shelters that stretched for miles beneath the city. The main bunker they claimed could house over 300 people, complete with its own power generator, water filtration system, and communication equipment that Emily had managed to repair using her technical expertise. The space felt like an underground city, with sleeping areas carved out of former storage rooms, a medical bay set up in what used to be an emergency command center, and workshops where Jake trained civilians in basic combat techniques and weapon maintenance. Emily had transformed a section of the bunker into a makeshift laboratory, using equipment salvaged from abandoned medical facilities and her own CDC resources to continue her research into the virus's origins and potential weaknesses. Her findings were both fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The pathogen wasn't naturally evolved. It showed clear signs of genetic modification, with synthetic elements that suggested advanced bioengineering techniques. More disturbing was her discovery that the virus had multiple activation triggers, meaning the initial outbreak was likely just the first phase of a larger biological weapon deployment. Emily had identified 3 distinct stages of infection: the initial transformation that turned humans into aggressive predators, a secondary phase that enhanced their coordination and problem-solving abilities, and a theoretical third stage that she prayed they would never witness. Her research indicated that the infected were becoming more intelligent and organized with each passing day, learning from their encounters with human survivors and adapting their hunting strategies accordingly. The microscopic analysis revealed that the virus was constantly mutating, potentially developing resistance to any cure she might develop. Jake had organized the bunker's defenses with military precision, establishing guard rotations, escape routes, and supply distribution systems that kept their growing community functioning despite the constant threat above ground. His scavenging teams had become legendary among the survivors, venturing into the infected city to retrieve essential supplies, weapons, and rescue isolated groups of humans. But Jake's latest reconnaissance missions had revealed a disturbing truth. They weren't the only organized survivor group in Phoenix, and not all of them were friendly. A faction calling themselves the Phoenix Covenant had taken control of the city's eastern districts, led by a charismatic former politician named Bradley Richardson who preached that the outbreak was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Richardson's followers had adopted brutal tactics, sacrificing infected and uninfected alike in religious ceremonies they believed would cleanse the world. Even more dangerous was a group of well-armed mercenaries who had established a black market trading post in the ruins of the financial district, selling weapons and supplies to the highest bidder while maintaining an uneasy truce with the infected through unknown means. Madison had become the community's unofficial social coordinator, organizing educational programs for the children, counseling sessions for traumatized survivors, and cultural activities that helped maintain morale in their underground refuge. Her 17 students had become junior leaders, helping to integrate new arrivals and teaching survival skills to younger children. But Madison's greatest contribution was her ability to maintain hope and humanity in a world that seemed determined to destroy both. She had established a school system within the bunker, ensuring that children continued learning despite the apocalyptic circumstances above ground. Her classes covered everything from basic literacy and mathematics to practical skills like first aid, radio operation, and conflict resolution. Madison had also started a daily news broadcast using the bunker's communication system, sharing information about successful rescue operations, scientific breakthroughs, and positive developments that reminded people they were fighting for something greater than mere survival. The peace of their underground sanctuary was shattered when a wounded survivor named Danny Martinez stumbled into their main entrance, carrying news that would change everything. Danny reported that Richardson's Phoenix Covenant had discovered the location of their bunker and was planning a massive assault to claim their resources and technology. Even worse, the mercenary group had apparently struck a deal with Richardson, providing military-grade weapons in exchange for territorial control after the bunker's capture. Danny's injuries told a story of torture and interrogation, suggesting that Richardson's followers had captured and questioned other survivors about the bunker's defenses and population. Emily's analysis of Danny's wounds revealed traces of a chemical compound that the infected seemed to avoid, explaining how Richardson's group had managed to move through the city with relative safety. Jake immediately began fortifying their defenses while Marcus organized evacuation protocols, but they all knew that their hidden sanctuary had become a target in a war that was about to expand far beyond simple survival. The countdown to their greatest challenge had begun, and the underground refuge that had seemed like salvation might soon become their tomb. 14 days after the outbreak began, Emily Watson stood in her makeshift laboratory, staring at the breakthrough that could either save humanity or doom them all. The potential cure pulsed in a glass vial, its amber liquid representing months of compressed research and desperate experimentation. But the formula was incomplete. She needed specific neurological compounds that could only be found in the advanced medical equipment at Phoenix General Hospital's research wing, located in the heart of the city's most infected district. Emily's calculations indicated that without these missing components, her cure would only slow the infection's progression rather than reverse it completely. The irony wasn't lost on her. To save the human race, they would have to venture into the epicenter of its destruction, where thousands of infected now roamed the streets in coordinated hunting packs that had learned to set traps and ambush tactics that made them deadlier than any natural predator. Marcus Rivera studied the tactical maps spread across the bunker's command table, his police training warring with the magnitude of what they were attempting. The hospital was 8 miles from their current position, through territory that had become a nightmare landscape of overturned vehicles, collapsed buildings, and infected swarms that moved with increasing intelligence and organization. His reconnaissance reports indicated that the infected had established what could only be described as territorial control, with different groups claiming specific areas of the city and defending them against intruders. More disturbing was the evidence that they were communicating with each other across great distances, possibly through chemical signals or low-frequency sounds that humans couldn't detect. Marcus had devised a multi-stage assault plan that would require splitting their limited resources while maintaining enough defenders to protect the bunker against Richardson's promised attack. The mission would demand perfect timing, absolute precision, and a level of courage that bordered on suicide. Jake Thompson had assembled what he privately considered the most unlikely special forces unit in military history, a team of volunteers that included a former nurse, 2 high school students, a retired firefighter, and a computer programmer who'd learned to fight during the past 2 weeks of hell. Jake's military experience told him that the mission was borderline impossible, but his moral code wouldn't let him abandon Emily's breakthrough or the hundreds of people counting on their success. The team had spent 3 days training in the bunker's lower levels, practicing urban warfare techniques, silent communication, and emergency medical procedures. Jake had modified their equipment with everything from construction tools to improvised explosives, creating an arsenal that reflected their desperate circumstances. The infected's behavioral patterns had become predictable in some ways. They were most active during dawn and dusk, avoided certain chemicals, and could be distracted by specific sound frequencies. But their increasing intelligence made every previous strategy potentially obsolete. Madison Clark had volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission, leading a diversionary operation that would draw the infected away from the hospital while the main team retrieved Emily's supplies. Her natural leadership abilities and deep understanding of human psychology made her uniquely qualified to coordinate the civilian volunteers who would create multiple distraction points across the city. Madison's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Simultaneous explosions and noise-making devices at key locations would fragment the infected swarms, creating windows of opportunity for the main assault team. Her 17 students had become her lieutenant commanders, each responsible for a specific aspect of the operation. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Madison like a physical force, knowing that her decisions would determine whether hundreds of people lived or died. But her teacher's instincts told her that sometimes the greatest lessons required the greatest risks. The mission launched at dawn on the 15th day, with Jake's team moving through the underground tunnels toward the hospital district while Madison's diversionary groups took positions throughout the city. The infected response was immediate and terrifying. They didn't just react to the distractions, they adapted to them, with some groups ignoring the decoys entirely while others appeared to be coordinating counterattacks. Emily accompanied the main team, her scientific expertise essential for identifying and extracting the correct compounds from the hospital's damaged equipment. The hospital itself had become a fortress of horror, with infected inhabitants that showed signs of advanced mutation and intelligence that suggested the virus was still evolving. Jake's team fought their way through corridors lined with medical equipment turned into crude weapons, past infected that had learned to use tools and work together with military-like precision. Emily's hands shook as she worked to extract the precious compounds, knowing that every second they remained in the hospital increased the likelihood that none of them would make it out alive. The sound of Madison's coordinated explosions echoed across the city, creating a symphony of destruction that would either herald humanity's salvation or mark the beginning of their final defeat. As Emily filled the last vial with the compounds she needed, the building around them began to collapse under the weight of the infected assault, forcing Jake to make a choice between completing the mission and saving his team from certain death. 21 days after the world ended, the rumble of military vehicles approaching from the east brought what should have been hope to the desperate survivors huddled in their underground sanctuary. Commander Patricia Hayes stood tall and confident as she surveyed the bunker complex, her crisp uniform and professional demeanor a stark contrast to the battle-worn appearance of Marcus, Emily, Jake, and Madison. The military checkpoint she'd established 3 miles outside Phoenix promised safety, supplies, and evacuation to a secure government facility in Colorado where scientists were supposedly working on permanent solutions to the infection crisis. Commander Hayes spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, assuring the survivors that their ordeal was nearly over and that the United States military had the situation under control. Her soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, setting up communications equipment and medical stations that demonstrated resources far beyond anything the survivors had managed to scavenge. But Emily's scientific instincts detected something wrong in the commander's too eager interest in her research and the specific questions she asked about the virus samples and cure formulation. The first sign of betrayal came when Commander Hayes demanded that Emily surrender all her research materials, virus samples, and cure prototypes for proper analysis by qualified military scientists. Emily's refusal triggered a confrontation that revealed the true nature of the military's mission. They weren't there to rescue survivors, but to acquire biological weapons research that could be weaponized for future conflicts. Commander Hayes explained with chilling pragmatism that the virus represented the next evolution of warfare, and Emily's work on cures and countermeasures was too valuable to remain in civilian hands. The commander's soldiers surrounded the bunker's main exits while she delivered an ultimatum: surrender the research voluntarily, or watch as her people were used as test subjects for military experiments with the virus. Marcus tried to negotiate, his police training telling him to find a peaceful solution, but Hayes dismissed his authority with the casual arrogance of someone who viewed local law enforcement as irrelevant in the new world order she was helping to create. Jake Thompson had encountered military corruption during his service overseas, but nothing had prepared him for the betrayal he witnessed as Commander Hayes revealed her true intentions. When Hayes ordered her soldiers to begin separating families and cataloging survivors for research purposes, Jake's moral code demanded action. The former Marine had spent weeks building trust and hope among the bunker's population, and he couldn't watch them be sacrificed for some twisted military agenda. Jake's resistance began subtly, with whispered warnings to other survivors and the strategic placement of weapons throughout the bunker complex. But when Hayes' soldiers began forcibly restraining Emily and confiscating her laboratory equipment, Jake made a decision that would define the final chapter of his life. The confrontation erupted when Jake disabled 2 soldiers who were threatening Madison's students, triggering a firefight that transformed the bunker into a battleground between survivors and the military forces that should have been protecting them. Madison Clark watched in horror as the supposed salvation turned into another nightmare, her teacher's instincts recognizing the psychological manipulation techniques Commander Hayes used to control and intimidate her followers. Madison's students looked to her for guidance as the situation deteriorated, their young faces reflecting the same fear and confusion she'd seen during the initial outbreak. When Hayes threatened to use the children as leverage to force Emily's cooperation, Madison's protective instincts overrode her survival training. She began quietly organizing an evacuation plan, using the bunker's hidden passages and emergency exits that Jake had shown her during their defensive preparations. Madison's natural leadership abilities proved invaluable as she coordinated the movement of over 200 survivors through underground tunnels while Jake's desperate battle provided the distraction they needed to escape. The climax of Jake's sacrifice came as he faced overwhelming odds, fighting both infected creatures that had been drawn by the sounds of battle and Hayes's well-trained soldiers who showed no mercy for civilians. Jake's final stand took place in the bunker's main command center, where Emily had hidden a fail-safe device that would destroy all research materials rather than let them fall into military hands. As infected poured through breaches in the bunker's defenses and soldiers advanced from multiple directions, Jake made the ultimate choice to activate Emily's virus destruction protocol. His last act was to ensure that Emily, Marcus, and Madison escaped through the emergency tunnels with the only remaining samples of the cure, while the explosion that claimed his life also eliminated the military's ability to weaponize the virus. Jake's heroic sacrifice saved hundreds of lives and preserved humanity's hope for recovery, but it came at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Commander Hayes survived the blast but lost everything she'd come to steal, leaving her stranded in the infected wasteland with diminished resources and the knowledge that her mission had failed due to one man's unwavering moral courage. The escape through the underground tunnels marked the end of their sanctuary period and the beginning of their most dangerous challenge yet, finding a new home while perfecting a cure that could save what remained of the human race. 28 days after Jake Thompson's heroic sacrifice, the weight of his loss pressed down on the remaining survivors like a physical burden as they faced their greatest and most desperate challenge yet. Emily Watson stood in the shadow of the Phoenix Water Treatment Facility, her modified cure formula finally perfected but requiring citywide distribution through the municipal water system to be effective against the evolved strain of infection that now dominated the urban landscape. The facility loomed before them like a fortress of twisted metal and concrete, its massive filtration towers crawling with hundreds of infected that had grown increasingly intelligent and coordinated in their hunting patterns. Emily's calculations indicated that if they could introduce her cure into the main distribution system, it would reach every remaining water source in the metropolitan area within 72 hours, potentially saving any surviving humans while slowly reversing the infection in those who had been turned. But the mission would require them to fight their way past evolved infected that had learned to set complex traps, coordinate group attacks, and adapt their strategies based on previous encounters with human survivors. Marcus Rivera studied the fortress-like water facility through military binoculars, his police training struggling to comprehend the tactical nightmare they were attempting to assault. The infected population had undergone a terrifying transformation since Jake's death, developing what could only be described as a primitive but effective military hierarchy. The creatures now moved in organized units, established patrol patterns, and had even learned to construct basic defensive positions using debris and abandoned vehicles. Marcus could identify at least 3 distinct types of evolved infected: the standard hunters that had plagued them from the beginning, larger and more powerful specimens that seemed to serve as squad leaders, and a new variant that appeared to be capable of complex problem-solving and strategic planning. The approach to the water facility was a killing field of overturned cars, collapsed overpasses, and improvised barriers that the infected had clearly constructed to funnel any attackers into predetermined ambush zones. Marcus knew that conventional assault tactics would be suicide, but Emily's cure represented humanity's last hope for reclaiming their world from the nightmare it had become. Madison Clark had transformed from an optimistic high school teacher into a hardened resistance leader, her natural ability to inspire and coordinate others now focused on organizing the most audacious diversionary operation in human history. With their numbers reduced to fewer than 150 active fighters, Madison had devised a plan that would create simultaneous attacks across 12 strategic locations throughout Phoenix, drawing the infected away from the water treatment facility while Marcus and Emily's core team attempted their infiltration. Madison's former students had become her field commanders, each leading small teams of volunteers in operations that range from explosive demolitions to psychological warfare tactics designed to exploit the infected's behavioral patterns. The plan required precise timing and flawless communication, with each diversionary team responsible for maintaining their distraction for exactly 47 minutes, long enough for the main assault to succeed, but not so long that the teams would be overwhelmed by the infected response. Madison carried the emotional weight of sending people she cared about into almost certain death, but her teacher's understanding of human nature told her that sometimes the greatest lessons required the ultimate sacrifice. The assault began at dawn with Madison's teams launching their coordinated strikes across the city, creating a symphony of explosions and chaos that drew massive swarms of infected away from their target. Emily accompanied the main infiltration team, her scientific expertise essential for navigating the facility's complex filtration systems and introducing her cure at the optimal injection points. The water treatment plant had become a nightmare landscape of infected that had evolved beyond anything they'd previously encountered, creatures that could scale vertical surfaces, coordinate complex flanking maneuvers, and even use rudimentary tools to enhance their attacks. Marcus led the assault team through the facility's maze of pipes and machinery, fighting past infected that seemed to anticipate their every move and adapt their defenses accordingly. Emily worked frantically to modify the facility's chemical injection systems while the battle raged around her, knowing that every second of delay meant more casualties among Madison's diversionary teams who were fighting and dying to give her this opportunity. The mission's success came at a devastating cost that would echo through the survivors' memories forever. Madison's teams had held their positions longer than anyone thought possible, but the price was measured in the lives of brave volunteers who chose to sacrifice themselves rather than abandon their posts. Emily successfully introduced her cure into the water system, but the facility's defensive systems had been corrupted by the infected, requiring manual activation of pumps and valves that exposed the team to overwhelming enemy fire. Marcus coordinated the fighting retreat from the facility as Emily's cure began flowing through the distribution network, but the infected's final assault claimed nearly half of their remaining fighters. As they escaped into the pre-dawn darkness, the survivors could hear the sound of the cure spreading through the city's water infrastructure, carrying with it humanity's last hope for redemption and the promise that Jake Thompson's sacrifice would not be in vain. 35 days after the outbreak that nearly ended human civilization, the first rays of sunrise painted the Phoenix skyline in shades of gold and crimson as Emily Watson stood on the observation deck of what had once been the city's tallest office building. The transformation below was nothing short of miraculous. Where hordes of infected had roamed just a week ago, confused and disoriented former victims now wandered the streets in various stages of recovery, their humanity slowly returning as Emily's cure worked its way through their damaged neural pathways. The process wasn't instant or complete. Many of the recovered showed permanent cognitive impairment from their time as infected, while others retained fragmented memories of their actions that would require years of psychological therapy to process. But they were alive, they were human, and they represented hope for a species that had come within hours of extinction. Emily's scientific mind cataloged the cure's effects with clinical precision, but her heart soared as she watched families reunite with loved ones they'd thought lost forever, the tears of joy visible even from her elevated vantage point. Marcus Rivera had traded his detective badge for the unofficial title of New Phoenix's first mayor, his natural leadership abilities and crisis management experience making him the obvious choice to coordinate the massive recovery effort. The challenges were overwhelming: establishing food and water distribution networks, creating temporary housing for thousands of confused and traumatized survivors, organizing medical care for people suffering from everything from infected bite wounds to severe malnutrition. Marcus had divided the city into manageable districts, each overseen by a team of volunteers who'd proven themselves during the darkest days of the outbreak. The police station had become a coordination center where Marcus worked 18-hour days, balancing the immediate needs of recovery with the long-term planning required to rebuild civilization from the ground up. The hardest part wasn't the logistics or the paperwork. It was making decisions about resource allocation when every choice meant the difference between life and death for desperate people who'd already lost everything once. Madison Clark had established the New Phoenix Educational Recovery Center in the ruins of Roosevelt High School, transforming the building where she'd first faced the infected into a symbol of humanity's resilience and determination to preserve knowledge and culture. Her innovative curriculum addressed the unique needs of a post-apocalyptic society, teaching traditional subjects alongside practical skills like urban agriculture, basic medical training, and conflict resolution techniques that would be essential for maintaining peace in their fragile new community. Madison's former students had become her teaching assistants, helping to educate younger children while serving as living examples that the next generation could overcome even the most traumatic experiences. The school also served as a counseling center where Madison used her natural empathy and understanding of human psychology to help survivors process their trauma and guilt. Many of the recovered infected struggled with memories of their actions during the outbreak, and Madison's patient guidance helped them understand that they weren't responsible for what the virus had made them do. The memorial service for Jake Thompson and the other fallen heroes took place in the center of what would become New Phoenix's main plaza, an open space surrounded by the skeletal remains of buildings that would eventually be rebuilt into something better than what had come before. Emily spoke about Jake's unwavering moral courage and the sacrifice that had made their victory possible, while Marcus described his friend's tactical brilliance and the military precision that had saved countless lives. Madison shared stories of Jake's unexpected gentleness with children and his ability to inspire hope even in the darkest moments of their struggle. The memorial wasn't just for Jake. It honored every person who died fighting for humanity's survival, from the volunteers who'd manned diversionary positions to the civilians who'd shared their last meals with hungry strangers. The ceremony concluded with the planting of an oak tree that would grow alongside their new civilization, its roots drawing strength from the same soil that had witnessed humanity's greatest tragedy and most inspiring triumph. As the weeks passed and the cure's effects became more widespread, Emily established the New Phoenix Research Institute in a fortified complex on the city's outskirts, her work now focused on ensuring that humanity would never again face such a catastrophic biological threat. Her team included survivors with scientific backgrounds as well as recovered victims whose unique insights into the infection's progression proved invaluable for developing early warning systems and prevention protocols. Emily's research had revealed that the original virus had been designed with multiple failsafes and kill switches, suggesting that its creators had feared losing control of their biological weapon. The knowledge gained from studying the outbreak would serve as humanity's insurance policy against future biological warfare, with Emily's protocols being shared with survivor communities across the globe via restored communication networks. The final entry in her research log reflected on the bitter irony that humanity's greatest victory had come from understanding their deepest vulnerability, and that the cure for their darkest impulses might be found in remembering what they'd almost lost. New Phoenix stood as a testament to the idea that even in the face of absolute destruction, human courage, sacrifice, and determination could forge a path toward redemption and hope for future generations who would inherit a world both scarred by tragedy and strengthened by the knowledge of what they could overcome together.